as well, didn't we? Ever, however, implacable, keeping his seasons and rages. That makes us think of the Ecclesiastes 3 word. Destroyer, this is setting us up already for some of the Hindu stuff that's coming, and Shiva and all of that. It also makes us think of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, preserver, destroyer and preserver, hero here. Reminder of what men choose to forget. Now, here already, let's put it in our notes. Our poet wants us to see rivers as symbolic, right? In other words, like a river, time is always flowing. The fact that we're using rivers takes us immediately back to the Heraclitus language at the very beginning. You'll remember Heraclitus, we said, was the philosopher of flow or flux. And he said, famously, you can never step into the same river twice, right? Life is like a river. A symbol of what men choose to forget. Unhonored, unpropitiated by worshipers of the machine, right? In other words, loving the science. We're going to get into this critique of science and the fact that science, evolution will in fact be mentioned in this poem. Science has somehow kind of made us think that we no longer need the past. And the views of evolution say we're always going forward and everything's always getting better. We don't need the past anymore. People, for example, who argue, why study poems that were written 100 or soon to be 100 years ago? I mean, it's a waste of our time. T.S. Eliot, as Voyager, will maybe make the argument, not so fast. Let's not get rid of some of these important understandings of the past, right? But waiting, the river, waiting, watching and waiting. His rhythm, the river, was present in the nursery bedroom. Now this is significant. In other words, right away we hear this idea that from the very beginning we were already being taught about the cycles of life. For the Lion King fans in the house, of course, you can think about that one and start singing your little song. But as we've often said, from your very youth, in your very early years, you were taught about this notion of cycles, and the river was always there. Of course, for T.S. Eliot, it literally was there, right? He saw it as a young child. As well, it was there in the rank Alintheus. This is more flower references of the April dooryard. You cannot read April dooryard and not think about when lilacs last and the dooryard bloomed. Whitman's tribute to Lincoln. Again, as I say, this is a very American poem. For those of us who have studied our American literature, we're already seeing lots of references. Already Twain's Huck Finn, already references here kind of to Whitman, allusions to Whitman. In the smell of grapes on the autumn table, and the evening circle in the winter gaslight, the very fact that the word circle is going to get used. The first 14 lines then will lead us, to get ready to start thinking then about his metaphors, his similes, his symbolism. The life is like a river. And then he says at line 15, the river is within us. And notice it's the first use of the word us. And we're going to have this pointed out to us. We're going to move from us to we throughout this movement. Let's pay attention to it. The sea is all about us. Now, some people have said that the language that comes here next, lines 15 through 27, are some of the most beautiful poetry, lyrical poetry that T.S. Eliot ever wrote. The sea is all about us. Now, of course, the sea, significant, right, when we think about the importance of the sea, so much of the globe, right? When you look at a globe, some of it is blue. Let's point that out, right? Okay. I like to think that there's already a tribute here being made to Lord Byron and his Pilgrim's Progress, especially that apostrophe to the ocean. I've given a lecture on that. You can take a look at that in Senior P. That celebration of the ocean as being majestic and scary at the same time, right? A pleasing fear, right? A pleasurable fear. Byron talks about it. The sea is all about us. The sea is the land's edge also. It's an interesting kind of paradox, right? The granite into which it reaches, the beaches where it tosses its hints, and again this word hints is the fallibilist position. We're going to come back to it again and again, this notion of hints, of earlier and other creation, right? See again lines 216, 217 with this notion of hints and guesses. The starfish, the horseshoe crab. The minute we hear the word crab from T.S. Eliot, we think about Prufrock. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Anybody can say I should have been born a crab. It takes a genius poet to say it that way in Prufrock. The whale's backbone. All this stuff is the stuff that the ocean kind of kicks up, right? Obviously, we have references here probably to T.S. Eliot as a youth when he was there off Cape Ann, and of course he was looking in the ocean and that kind of thing, and there along the coastline when things get kicked up or whatever, right? The pools it offers to our curiosity. Later he says, I sometimes wonder. This will be a poem of curiosity. And then I suppose we should say out loud that if we're going to learn anything from T.S. Eliot and Four Quartets, old men ought to be explorers, that it is, we got to have some curiosity. We got to have some sense of wonder. And for Eliot, he says, the ocean was that, right? Offers to our curiosity. The more delicate algae, we've got more plant references. The sea anemone as well, more plant references. It tosses up our losses. The torn seam, the net has been torn. It's a great symbol. The shattered lobster pot, the broken oar, the gear of foreign dead men. All of this for T.S. Eliot is, again, this word foreign takes some back to this notion of the brown god, and again, making this somewhat an American poem maybe. The sea has many voices, as opposed to the Greeks who kind of saw Poseidon or Titan in the single voice. No, many voices, many gods and many voices, he finishes at line 25, 26 and 27. The salt is on the briar rose. Go back to East Coker, line 168 for the briar. And the fog is in the fir trees. And again, this notion of the language is beautiful melodic language, right? Of course, fog keeps us from being able to see. We think of our Shakespeare's Macbeth opening lines, hover through the fog and filthy air. I think there's some reason to focus on this word fog for a second and to point out that in some ways what the poems of Four Quartets are all trying to do is to make clear what is often not so clear. Why? Because there's kind of like a fog or a mist that sometimes keeps us from being able to see and understand, right? We had the experience but lack the meaning, right? Remember, he says, we're sometimes lost. Exactly what is it that's going on? We then turn in lines 28 through 50, and after we've heard about our ocean and the nautical museum of death, as Kramer will refer to it, right? We then will turn to the rhythm that is remarkable. Many have pointed this out. There's like a remarkable rhythm that's almost like an undertow of the ocean itself when we read this. Not totally unlike that recognition that we pointed out that you have when you pick up Conrad's Heart of Darkness and you read that. A boat is moored on the Thames, and Marlowe is telling his story while that boat is rocking back and forth. And several of you have pointed out that when you read out loud those opening lines of Heart of Darkness, you get that sense. You also get it here. The sea howl. We think of Ginsberg and his howl, right? The sea yelp. We think of Whitman and his barbaric yelp. Are different voices, often heard together. All of the voices that are being referenced. The whine and the rigging. The menace and caress a wave that breaks on water. And again, many have pointed out these Whitman-esque like lines. I mean, I hear America singing the varied carols I hear, all come back to mind. The distant rope and the granite teeth, we're back to more granite. And the wailing warning from the approaching headland are all sea voices. And the heavy and the heaving groaner, he says in his introductory comments, that the groaner is a buoy that sits out there so that people know this is dangerous here, right? Rounded homewards, the seagull, more birds, of course, we think immediately of the albatross of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And under the oppression of the Simon fog, back to it, the tolling bell. Now we're going to get this bell and the references to bell, as we did from the earlier two poems, the clanging of the bell and all of that. And in fact, the bell will be the last two words of this part, won't it, right? Measures time, not our time. By the way, notice this is our first use of the word time, right? Wrung by the unhurried groundswell. A time, notice the repetition, again and again and again. We think of Poe's use of the bells, ringing over and over again, right? A time older than the time of chronometers, older than time counted by anxious, worried women. We should point out that these women we'll come back to in line 179 later in this poem. We should also point out that women have a larger part to play in Dry Salvages than in the earlier two poems, right? The anxious, worried women lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel. Notice again the trinities, right? T.S. Eliot, very influenced, of course, by his reading of both St. Augustine, who loved his Trinities, as well as Francis Bacon, who loved his Trinities, as we say in our lectures on Bacon, right? And piece together the past and the future. And what else is Four Quartets trying to do than that? Piece together the past and the future. The women who lie in bed at night thinking about their husbands or their sons who are off, or their brothers who are off on the ocean waves out there, and wondering if they're going to come back, trying to figure out what's going to happen, trying to piece together the past and the future. Between midnight and dawn, that time in the evening, in the early morning. But the word between immediately sets us up to those lines earlier in East Coker when he said that he's spent so much of his last 20 years between two wars. I think, again, we've got this struggle here that's being played out, this notion of being between, or the struggle or the tension, as we pointed it out, the political one, the literary one, and then, of course, the spiritual one. Between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception. The idea of deception we've seen already earlier in East Coker. The future, futureless, before the morning watch, when time stops, and time is never ending. Again, the use of this word time now at the end of the part one. And the groundswell that is and was from the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, of course, to the John 1 reference. Clangs. I love T.S. Eliot's verbs. Just pay attention to his verbs. You could do something really cool by going through all the four quartets and just circling with a copy that you have all of the verbs and just paying attention to the wonderful verbs that he uses here. Clangs the bell. The bell, in other words, is always there, right? Now, the rhythm, again, as we pointed out, kind of has the rhythm of the undertow. And the bells come to mind here. The angel Gabriel's Annunciation and the birth of Christ, of course, comes to mind here. New life emerging through death and all of that. Let's finish section 1 now quickly, working at 2a. Well, of course, one major message: life is like the river, the sea, always flowing, and you can't always control it. Maybe guide a river, but you know we're familiar with what happens, of course, when those river banks start to overflow. At 2b, of course, our symbols here, the river and the sea, are obviously a major symbol. Repetition and echoes, well, I'm going to mention time and the bells here, right, at lines 37 and 50. At 3a, I'm going to reference a poet that was very influential in the thinking of T.S. Eliot. And I haven't mentioned a lot about John Donne. You can go and take a look at some of the lectures I've already given, especially Valediction, Forbidding Morning. You'll remember, and that's in the Senior A folder on LearnStrong.net, you'll remember that I said about John Donne that he was a metaphysical poet who tried to explain that second box as opposed to that first box of Plato's theory of the forms. And I think it's significant that T.S. Eliot was working, I think, clearly with this idea of Meditation 17, no man is an island, entire of himself. We're all a part of the Maine, we're all a part of the land of England. Don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Hemingway, of course, will name his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls. I think that all of that is sitting as well with T.S. Eliot here. Finally, at 3b, which metaphor works better for you? A 3b question that's personal. Which metaphor works better for you? Land or water? And why? I mean, which one? I mean, we obviously worked with land in the earlier poems, right? Now we're working with water as a reference or a symbol of what it means to be alive. Well, I'll let you kind of play that one out. We live in the mountains, so maybe for you, the land is a metaphor that works more strongly. Of course, we also live in the mountains where there are creeks and of course, rivers, so we know both of these, don't we? All right, let's turn now to Dry Salvages 2. Sudden illumination is our topic here. We're working lines 51 to 125, or in cumulated numbering 440 to 551. Okay, so we're going to pay attention to the structure right away. Take a look, for example, at the opening lines 51 through 86, and notice when you just count up in terms of stanzas, count up the lines. This is what we're going to call a sestina, and we're going to look at those 6 lines and we're going to pay attention to that. We're also going to hear about the Annunciation. The Annunciation, of course, when Mary in the New Testament, in the Gospel accounts, is told that she will have a son, and that son will be named the Messiah. And of course, in Christian theology, the Annunciation is so important as understanding the Incarnation, which will, of course, lead ultimately to Good Friday and to Easter and to all of that at the end of the life of Christ. Okay, let's go ahead and turn now again. Alec Dennis will go to our reading. I challenge you again. Pay particular attention to the words. Try to conquer monkey mind instead of just listening. Read along and see how well you do. All right, here we go. Part 2. Dry Salvages.
Where is there an end of it? The soundless wailing, the silent withering of autumn flowers, dropping their petals and remaining motionless. Where is there an end to the drifting wreckage, the prayer of the bone on the beach, the unprayable prayer of the calamitous Annunciation? There is no end but addition, the trailing consequence of further days and hours, while emotion takes to itself the emotionless years of living among the breakage of what was believed in as the most reliable, and therefore the fittest for renunciation. There is the final addition, the failing pride or resentment at failing powers, the unattached devotion which might pass for devotionless in a drifting boat with a slow leakage, the silent listening to the undeniable clamor of the bell of the last Annunciation. Where is the end of them, the fisherman sailing into the wind's tail, where the fog cowers? We cannot think of a time that is oceanless, or of an ocean not littered with wastage, or of a future that is not liable, like the past, to have no destination. We have to think of them as forever bailing, setting and hauling, while the northeast lowers over shallow banks unchanging and erosionless, or drawing their money, drying sails at dockage, not as making a trip that will be unpayable for a haul that will not bear examination. There is no end of it, the voiceless wailing, no end to the withering of withered flowers, to the movement of pain that is painless and motionless, to the drift of the sea and the drifting wreckage, the bone's prayer to death its God. Only the hardly, barely prayable prayer of the one Annunciation. It seems, as one becomes older, that the past has another pattern and ceases to be a mere sequence or even development, the latter a partial fallacy encouraged by superficial notions of evolution, which becomes, in the popular mind, a means of disowning the past. The moments of happiness, not the sense of well-being, fruition, fulfillment, security, or affection, or even a very good dinner, but the sudden illumination. We had the experience but missed the meaning, and approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form, beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness. I've said before that the past experience revived in the meaning is not the experience of one life only, but of many generations, not forgetting something that is probably quite ineffable, the backward look behind the assurance of recorded history, the backward half-look over the shoulder towards the primitive terror. Now we come to discover that the moments of agony, whether or not due to misunderstanding, having hoped for the wrong things or dreaded the wrong things is not in question, are likewise permanent, with such permanence as time has. We appreciate this better in the agony of others, nearly experienced, involving ourselves, than in our own. For our own past is covered by the currents of action, but the torment of others remains an experience unqualified, unworn by subsequent attrition. People change and smile, but the agony abides. Time the destroyer is time the preserver. Like the river with its cargo of dead Negroes, cows and chicken coops, the bitter apple and the bite in the apple, and the ragged rock in the restless waters, waves wash over it, fogs conceal it. On a halcyon day it is merely a monument. In navigable weather it is always a sea mark to lay a course by. But in the somber season, or the sudden fury, is what it always was.
Okay, let's turn now to the second part, and let's point out again right away the sestina that is going to begin. T.S. Eliot showing us his true poetic genius. Take a look at, for example, the last words of each one of these different lines, stanzas, 51 through 86. For example, notice, quailing, line 51. 57, trailing, line 63. Failing, line 69. Sailing. Now look at the last word on at line 52. The second line of the first stanza of part 2. Flowers, line 58. Hours, line 64. Powers, all the way through. Okay? So you can see that here we have very intentional poetic form. I mean, I could get into it in more detail, I won't. But let's go ahead now and turn to what specifically it is that he's saying when he begins with a question that takes him 6 lines from line 51 to 56 to be able to get through. Where is there an end of it? Well, an end of what? The soundless wailing. We've heard this word wailing already. The sound of the sea. The silent withering of autumn flowers. We're back to, again, to this notion of flowers, right? Well, what's going on here? Well, basically, we're looking in this sestina of lines 51 through 86, different understandings of Annunciation and 3 different senses of death. Notice, first, the one we're reading about now, dropping their petals, remaining motionless. Here we have physical death. Where is there an end to the drifting wreckage? And we recognize we're not just talking about shipwrecked and people who have drowned at sea. We think, of course, of the Phoenician sailor from the wasteland, as we read it in our last lecture. The prayer, the first use of the word prayer, of the bone on the beach, the unprayable prayer at the calamitous